potentially affect the environment. So that means subdivisions, adoption of a general plan, which is a public project, conditional use permits to allow someone to, I don't know, operate a racetrack, changes to zoning. All sorts of privately initiated projects suddenly came under the CEQA mantle or umbrella. And so since 1972, CEQA has had this very broad application as we know it today. By 1974, the legislature had also stepped in and made a lot of expansions to CEQA. So the CEQA that we see now is pretty much the CEQA that we saw in 1974 with a few tweaks here and there around the edges of it. There's amendments every few years, but for the most part, the actual gist of CEQA, the thrust of CEQA has not really changed since about 1974. So we have the next slide, please. Yeah, so objectives of CEQA, it's basically disclosure, the idea of disclosing information to decision makers and thereby making their decisions better. Providing information to the public in case the public wants to know what's going to happen with a particular project. Identifying ways to avoid or reduce environmental damage that might otherwise occur as a result of the project. Disclosing the reasons in public for why the agency is approving a project that might have significant and unavoidable impacts. Also, it fosters interagency review because CEQA documents like a environmental impact report and other sorts of CEQA documents have to go out for public review before the project is approved. And the public has an opportunity to chime in on whether or not they think the coverage of potential impacts is adequate. And then it enhances public participation in the planning process because CEQA is enforced by litigation. It's enforced by lawsuit. There's no CEQA police at the state level or any other level. It's enforced by members of the public, other agencies, organizations bringing suit against the agency that's prepared the environmental document, alleging that they've done something wrong. And so over the years, we're averaging probably 25 to 30 reported Court of Appeal cases on CEQA. So those are precedent-setting cases on CEQA. It's been on the books for 40 years, so you can do the math. There's hundreds and hundreds of cases out there dealing with CEQA and interpreting different parts of CEQA. If we can have the next slide. So that's another way that the public participates. So the top 5 concepts, if we were to do that, one is disclosure, what the project is, what the impacts on the environment might be, ways of avoiding those impacts, if it might have significant unavoidable impacts, what some alternatives to the project might be that would avoid impacts. It's supposed to be a good faith effort at disclosure, so it doesn't have to be perfect. CEQA process doesn't have to be perfect, but as we can see from the gazillions of major court cases, being perfect is really important. And then there's analysis. The analysis has to link facts to conclusions, so it isn't just, well, here's what the project is going to do, oh, and here's what the impact will be. It's here's what the project will do, here's how that fits into, I don't know, air quality or biological resources or other sorts of potential impact areas, and here's what we conclude the significance of that project would be in the context of those particular resources. It requires comments, or it doesn't require comments, but it opens up the process for comments from members of the public, from other agencies, so that during the CEQA process, other people can inject themselves into the activities and the considerations of the agency that's going to be undertaking the project. And although the agency that's undertaking the project, whether it's their own project or a private project they're considering, even though they're in charge of the CEQA process, nonetheless, these comments that they get can make a difference in how they go about making their considerations. And then finally, mitigation. CEQA requires that the agency incorporate mitigation into the project unless it's infeasible. And so that means with that obligation, if it's the agency's own project, they have to work the mitigation into their project. If they're approving a private project, it means that they have to place conditions of approval on that project that match the mitigation measures to ensure that the person who's actually doing the project is going to avoid the impacts to the environment. We've had some recent court cases. One just came out of the California Supreme Court where the Cal State system attempted to avoid mitigation for traffic impacts. In that case, they said, well, you know, these traffic impacts aren't going to occur on our campus. They're going to occur nearby. Therefore, we don't have to mitigate for those. Also, the legislature hasn't given us any money other than our main budget to pay for these impacts, so therefore we're not going to do them. We're not going to do the mitigation measures. Supreme Court said no. Well, you look at CEQA. CEQA requires an agency to mitigate unless it's infeasible, and simply because you haven't been allocated special environmental mitigation funds doesn't mean that you don't have funds within your own budget to pay for it. So it's pretty clear that mitigation is something that's required, whether it's on-site mitigation or whether it's trying to mitigate the impacts that your project would have on off-site areas. The agency is required to mitigate either for its own projects or if it's a private project for the impacts that that private project might have. So next slide. Okay, so this is a really simple diagram of how CEQA works. And the vertical thing is basically the public agency applies CEQA, the green, to projects under CEQA. That's not every sort of thing they do. Things that are ministerial are not projects. So in other words, if the agency has no ability to say no to the project, that's not subject to CEQA. These are things like building permits, dog licenses. You simply come in, you show that you've met all the standards, and the agency stamps it, and you pay your fee, and out the door you go. That's a ministerial project not subject to CEQA, even though that activity may have an impact on the environment. So if it's discretionary, subject to CEQA, ministerial, not subject to CEQA. If it's something that is administrative, has no physical change in the environment, it's not subject to CEQA. If there's a physical change in the environment, but the potential for physical change, either directly or indirectly, subject to CEQA. So an example of something that would have indirect changes to the environment is the adoption of a general plan, for example, or a climate action plan, something where we're dedicating ourselves to undertake some activities, and those activities later on may have a direct impact on the environment. They don't right now, but once we start implementing them, they could. So a city general plan, adoption of a new city zoning ordinance, all of those things are projects under CEQA as well, even though they don't have direct impacts right now. So public agency will look at their project, determine whether or not there may be an exemption that applies to it. CEQA has a bunch of different sorts of exemptions that essentially kick projects out of the CEQA process. So if it's a relatively minor project, or if it's a project for which the legislature has carved out a statutory exemption or a legal exemption, then CEQA doesn't have to be done. But otherwise, the agency then begins to analyze whether or not this project may have a significant effect on the environment. And if it looks as though they might, or it might, they will then go on to prepare an environmental impact report. If it looks as though none of the impacts would be significant impacts, then it will prepare what's called a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration. And the idea of negative declaration is basically declaring in the negative that there would be no impacts of this project on the environment. It's kind of a strange name for it. Negative declaration makes it sound as though the project is bad, but it actually means that the project is good. It's not necessarily bad for the environment. It's kind of a even sort of project, neither good nor bad. So next slide. Definition of a project. So here we go. Discretionary action, direct impacts. If we can move on to the next one once we get through all of them. So no piecemealing. Piecemealing is the idea that you take one project, break it up into bite-sized chunks, and thereby avoid having to do an environmental impact report on that project. Because environmental impact reports generally apply to projects that would have the potential for a significant impact on the environment. Some clever folks have decided that, well, gosh, if we simply broke up our project into little bits and pieces, well, this part wouldn't have an impact, and that part wouldn't have an impact, and neither would that. And so we'll do a negative declaration for each of those parts individually, rather than looking at the project as a whole. So that's not allowed under CEQA. If you have more than one activity, let's call them activity A and activity B. If B is reasonably foreseeable consequence of A, then that's something that has to be looked at in the same environmental analysis as activity A. It might be, for example, that activity B is the extension of a road to serve activity A. Activity B is a future phase of activity A. Activity A, let's say, is a very large subdivision that's going to be developed in phases. Phase 1 would be activity B, phase 3, or I should say activity A, phase 2, 3, 4, those are all activity B. Activity B provides essential public services for activity A. Perhaps activity B is the expansion of the wastewater treatment plant that's needed in order to serve the new subdivision that's represented by activity A. And then A and B are integral parts and lack independent utility. In other words, they're things that are dependent on one another. So we're putting in, we're putting in a new wastewater treatment plant and also new sewer mains all over the city. So we can't break up the installation of the wastewater treatment plant and the installation of the sewer mains because they're really all part of the same project. We're upgrading the sewer system. So A and B would both be integral parts. So we're going to switch again, next one. So some essential rules. There's basically 3 levels of analysis to CEQA. One is that the thing may be exempt. So agencies look for that first off. There may be a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration indicated because it's not going to have a significant effect on the environment. Or it could be that there's an argument that it may have a significant effect on the environment, and so we prepare an environmental impact report, or the famous EIR. Both the mitigated neg dec, the neg dec, and the EIR all require some sort of detailed analysis of the project as well as public review of the draft of the environmental analysis. Another basic rule of CEQA is that the baseline for analysis, in other words, where do you start your analysis? The analysis is normally existing conditions as they are today. So that, for example, if a county was updating its general plan, the general plan is a plan the county has adopted that identifies how it's going to be developed in the future. If the county decides they want to amend their general plan, they need to look at the area that's being amended in the context of what's there right now. Not what's planned for the area, but what's there right now, existing conditions. So that's a major tenet of CEQA. You need to look at what are existing conditions, what's there right now, versus what would things be like with this project. And the difference between them, the delta between them, that's how we determine whether or not there might be a significant impact. We also have something called the fair argument. The fair argument is what triggers environmental impact reports. And it's kind of a complicated idea. It seems simple in when you think of fair, but I mean it's kind of complicated. Basically, it's whenever there is an argument raised during the public hearing process, during the comment period, during the CEQA process in general, that the project may have a significant effect on the environment, then an environmental impact report has to be done. And the argument has to be based on something called substantial evidence. So it has to be on factual evidence, expert opinion that might be based on factual evidence, or perhaps studies and those sorts of things that are factually based. So fair argument is what triggers the need to do environmental impact reports all up and down the state. It also creates a fertile field for those who may want to sue an agency arguing that an environmental impact report should have been done for a project rather than a negative declaration or a mitigated negative declaration. So it's kind of what keeps agencies honest and ensures that projects that may have the potential for impact have this full environmental impact report done for them. And then agencies are supposed to undertake a good faith effort at disclosure, so they're not supposed to hide anything. If there's a lawsuit over a CEQA project or a CEQA document, they're going to have to disclose what the administrative record is, so they have to make full disclosure. If someone wants to get a copy of the information that was used in the preparation of one of these environmental documents, agency has to provide that to the public. So they have to make this good faith effort at disclosure in the document and then with the material that they use to prepare the document. And then, as I mentioned before, if you're the agency, you have to mitigate for those impacts. And if it's a private project, you have to require the private applicant to mitigate for impacts of their project, unless it's infeasible. And what's infeasible? It would be something that would be extraordinarily more expensive than the project itself. It might be something that is legally impossible to do. It might be something that is simply infeasible from a technological point of view. We want to, I know if we're going to have a lot of solid waste from this project, we're going to build a small rocket launching pad on the project site and launch it into space. Well, that's infeasible because it'd be really expensive. It's probably technologically infeasible. Probably wouldn't be sanctioned by any air quality agency because of all of the air pollutants that you'd create by launching this rocket into space. So you have to have things that are feasible, things that can actually be done. Okay, so next one. What else do we have here? Oh, okay, so very short CEQA glossary. We won't say much about this. Categorical exemptions, or CAT-X's. You'll hear people call them a CAT-X. Sometimes people even call them a CE if they want to be even shorter. They're a limited get-out-of-CEQA free card, so they're essentially an exemption from having to do CEQA under certain circumstances. EIR is Environmental Impact Report, the big CEQA study. An initial study is essentially what it says. It's the initial study that you do to determine whether or not you have to do a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration, or whether you have to do an environmental impact report. The lead agency is the agency that's primarily responsible for CEQA compliance. They're the ones who have to either write these documents or contract out for somebody to write them. Mitigated negative declaration means that it's the sort of document done when a project would not have a significant effect on the environment because you're applying mitigation measures that reduce any impacts below a level of significance. A negative declaration means that the project wouldn't have a significant impact on the environment, also called a neg dec or an ND sometimes. Project, discretionary action with physical effects. Responsible agency, it's another agency besides the lead agency that's going to be considering approvals for this project. So for example, if I wanted to subdivide my property and I was in the city of Sacramento, but my property also had a creek running through the middle of it that I want to bulldoze over, I would need to get the subdivision map approved by the city of Sacramento. They would be the lead agency. And I would also need to get a streambed alteration agreement from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they would be a responsible agency. Because if I didn't get the approval from the city, the responsible agency would never have to act. So the city is the lead agency. Department of Fish and Wildlife would be the responsible agency in that situation. And then there's trustee agencies. It's kind of a term of art used for 4 different agencies in the state, and it really only applies when a project is handed over to the state clearinghouse here in Sacramento for distribution to state agencies for them to review and comment on the draft environmental document being done for that project. Okay, so next. So acronyms, CE, EIR, ESA, we talk about the ESA, the FISA, the CECA, basically the Endangered Species Act under federal law and under California law, slightly different, well not slightly, different acts applying to different species in some cases. DFW, Department of Fish and Wildlife, IS, we use the term IS, it means initial study. Sometimes it would be ISMND, meaning initial study for purposes of supporting a mitigated negative declaration, or an ISND. NOD, a notice of determination, NOE, a notice of exemption. These are notices that the public agency will file with the county clerk after it's approved a project. So if it approves a project, it has to file these notices. Why would they file notice? Well, the notice is actually a legal notice that begins a statute of limitations for CEQA challenges. So even though we talk about CEQA, or not we, but some talk about CEQA being this huge generator of litigation, CEQA has some things in it that attempt to limit litigation to an extent. And so it has this relatively short statute of limitations. After a project's approved, the agency will file a notice of determination or a notice of exemption. Statute of limitations begins, and then anybody who wants to sue the agency has to file that lawsuit within about a month. And if they don't file the lawsuit within that time, they lose the opportunity to file a lawsuit. The California Supreme Court's looked at the idea of the notice of determination and these relatively strict time limits for filing lawsuits, and they've upheld it. They said basically, you know, even though this notice is filed in an obscure office, the county clerk's office, if you're a project opponent, you should know about it. And even though the agency may not have told you that they filed it with the county clerk on the 1st of this month, you needed to file your lawsuit by the 31st of the month. And if you didn't do that, sorry, you're out of luck. So it creates this statute of limitations. We have something called an NOP, or a Notice of Preparation. It's part of the Environmental Impact Report preparation. OPR, where Holly's from, Office of Planning and Research. That's where the State Clearinghouse, or the SCH, lives. The State Clearinghouse is a central point of contact for anyone with a CEQA document, either an environmental impact report or a negative declaration or mitigated negative declaration that somehow involves a state agency, whether the state agency is a lead agency, a responsible agency, or a trustee agency. If they're involved, you have to file your documents with the State Clearinghouse in draft form. They will then send them out to all the state agencies that might have some concern about that project. So if, again, my subdivision here in the city of Sacramento that's going to involve covering over a stream, they would typically send that, the State Clearinghouse would typically send that to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They'd probably send it to the Air Resources Board, probably the Department of Parks and Recreation. So they would send it to a whole variety of different agencies for them to review, and if they have any comments, to give those comments back to the State Clearinghouse, who then turns around and gives the comments back to the lead agency. It seems like kind of an awkward and backward process, and it kind of is, because it comes out of the 1970s before we had email, pre-faxes, even before we had faxes. So it's like 3 or 4 technology generations behind the rest of us. We also have something called a program EIR. It's a type of EIR that's designed so that once you have done one of these program EIRs, then there'll be a streamlined approach to CEQA for all the activities that occur within that program, so that you don't have to necessarily do a new environmental impact report every time there's an activity that was already approved and analyzed as part of the program EIR. So PEIR, that's what that means, pair. Okay, so next one, here we go. So this just gives you an idea of how the key participants all enter REACT. And this is an old slide, sorry about that. Somewhere between, over on the left-hand side, between responsible agencies and trustee agencies, there should be another little quadrilateral, or whatever you call it, quadrilateral angled box there for Native American tribes. As of July 1st of this year, Native American tribes are now called into, or now have the opportunity to consult on CEQA projects when they have notified the lead agency that they would like to do so. So there should be another little box out there. I thought I'd picked up the right slide here, but I guess I didn't. So all these other agencies kind of rotate around the lead agency, giving their input to the lead agency, and the lead agency takes that input, considers it, and prepares the environmental documents as necessary. And then out to the side with the dotted line are the courts. Courts don't get involved in CEQA unless someone sues the agency. So in the vast majority of projects, of the probably tens of thousands of projects every year that are subject to CEQA, in the vast majority there is no lawsuit. It only tends to be on the high-profile projects, general plan amendments, big subdivisions, I don't know, tearing down the historic courthouse, those sorts of things that people just don't like for one reason or another. Those tend to be the ones that draw the litigation, and the vast majority of projects are not subject to CEQA litigation, and you never hear about them. They just proceed. Some of those projects are probably not in conformance with CEQA. Some of those agencies are probably not following what CEQA has to say, but no harm, no foul. If there's no lawsuit over it, they're never held to account. So we don't know how many of those there might be. Okay, next slide. Okay, so lead and responsible agencies, again, I think I mentioned this. Lead agency is the one that's either undertaking the project or has primary approval over the project. Responsible agency is another agency that's going to be considering whether or not to grant approval to the project. Okay, so we can switch again. So exemptions, a couple different types. Statutory exemptions, they're actually written into the law. Most of them are in CEQA. A few are found here and there elsewhere in the California codes, but most of them are in CEQA. They can be everything from an absolute get-out-of-free CEQA card for things like railroad grade crossings. If you want to put in a railroad grade crossing for safety purposes, even though the railroad grade crossing may be 25, 30 feet high, that's not subject to CEQA because there's a statutory exemption whereby the legislatures and the governor at the time agreed, we're just going to not make that subject to CEQA. At one point in time, the 1984, whenever it was, the Los Angeles Olympics was largely exempted from CEQA because the legislature and the governor at the time decided that would just get in the way if they had to do CEQA for all the new venues and that sort of stuff. So we'll just exempt it. There's no public review period or anything like that. Agencies can and often do file a notice of exemption, and that gives them the statute of limitations of 35 days, or about a little more than a month. Okay, so categorical exemptions, next one. Oops, so I guess we have some common ones. So we have ministerial project, emergency projects, feasibility planning studies. All of those are some examples of generalized sorts of statutory exemptions. So in other words, if you are, I don't know, Tuolumne County, and there's a wildfire that's broken out near Sonora, and you need to send all of your air tankers in there landing at the little, what is it, Jamestown Airport? No, the Columbia Airport. And they're bringing in fuel trucks to fuel the air tankers and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot more air traffic coming in and out of the little airport. That's not subject to CEQA. It's an emergency. They need to do that right away. They're cutting bulldozer lines through habitat for endangered species. That's not subject to CEQA because it's an emergency. They need to do it. Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Jenny. So sudden unexpected occurrence, clear and imminent danger, immediate action either needed to avoid the thing or to respond to the damages that have occurred. A bridge has fallen down due to an earthquake. You can go in and fix the bridge without necessarily having to do CEQA because you have to fix it right away after that emergency. On the other hand, if you come back 5 years from now and you decide, well, we'd like to fix that bridge, that might not qualify for an emergency exemption because you had all that time. It wasn't something that was immediate. There's also something called the general rule or common sense exemption that the California Supreme Court has kind of carved out recently. And it basically says where it can be seen with certainty that no environmental effect may occur, you don't have to do CEQA. That one's a little bit on the dangerous side. Not very many agencies use it because it's very difficult to see with certainty that nothing is going to happen from your project. So it can apply to any sort of activity, but agencies have to be careful in using it because if they're challenged, there's a good chance that that sort of thing wouldn't survive because everything has some sort of an impact. Okay, next one. And categorical exemptions, 33 different types or classes, and they're primarily, or all really, they're all minor sorts of projects that typically don't have any potential for impact on the environment. So it might be, adding a room onto an existing building, building 2 or 3 small, not even small, 2 or 3 residential units. Those things are typical categorical exemptions. It also applies to things like restoration projects that take up less than 5 acres of land. It applies to rehabilitation of historic buildings when done in accordance with federal law. So it applies to a variety of different things, all of them found by the Secretary of the Natural Resources Agency to be typically insignificant sorts of little projects. No public review period again. They have this 35-day statute of limitations if anybody wants to sue, but they are restricted. They're not a full get-out-of-CEQA free card the way a statutory exemption might be. The agency is still obligated to see whether or not there may be something unusual about the circumstances of this particular project and whether there may be some significant impact as a result. So if the project doesn't fit within one of the classes of categorical exemption, you can't use it. If it looks as though there's some circumstances that indicate there might be a significant impact, you can't use it either. Okay, and you can't apply mitigation measures, of course. These are just the classes, and we can hit the next one too, I think. Yeah, designation of wilderness areas, cogeneration projects at existing facilities with some strict restrictions on using that, infill development projects as described. For each one of these classes, the CEQA guidelines that's been adopted by the state, the CEQA guidelines lays out all the qualifying criteria for these. So we've just very briefly summarized them there, but in the guidelines there's actually quite a bit more discussion of each one of them and how you get to use them. So class 1, for example, existing facilities, operation, repair, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives you an idea or a flavor for how the guidelines describe these things and the sorts of limitations they place on them. So as long as you fall within this limitation, you could use this exemption, and there's no, it doesn't look as though there's some unusual circumstances that would lead you to think that there would be an impact on the environment. If, for example, your house, you wanted to use this for an expansion of your house, but what do you know, your house is right on a cliff, and that expansion would potentially lead to destabilization of the cliff because you, for whatever reason, maybe you're Donald Trump, you decide you can do anything you want. You want to build right out over the cliff. That might be an unusual circumstance, and you'd look to see whether or not there might be a significant impact. There might be because it would destabilize the cliff, and the cliff could fall down on the neighbors down below you, and so you wouldn't be able to use that exemption. So these are the sorts of things that place limitations on the use of the exemptions. So next one. Yeah, small new construction or conversion. Again, you can see that it applies to little structures, utility extensions, accessory structures, that kind of stuff. Again, specific limitations. And then next one, minor alterations of land. So it might be a small subdivision. It could be grading where there's less than 10% slope, where you don't involve the cutting of healthy, mature scenic trees, that sort of thing. So again, a specific set of limitations on the use of this exemption, all of which are intended to bring it down to a level of less than significant for any time it's applied. And information collection. So if you're simply going out to collect information about a site, you don't need to do an environmental analysis. So you wouldn't end up doing an environmental impact report for the studies necessary to prepare an environmental impact report. You get a break on doing that. And then accessory structures, the idea of small structures, little on-premise signs, small parking lots, lifeguard towers, all of those sorts of things. Another type of exemption commonly used. And then infill development projects. Projects in city limits, doesn't apply to counties, but only cities, where it's surrounded by urban uses, less than 5 acres, and has these other sorts of limitations on it. This has been a very popular exemption. It's been used by lots and lots of cities up and down the state, including the city of Sacramento, where we are right now. City of Berkeley has used a lot of them. And so it's been very effective in essentially streamlining CEQA for relatively small infill projects within downtowns or within city limits too. The next one. So there's a bunch of exceptions, and these are the exceptions. If you are affecting sensitive environments, if there are these unusual circumstances about the site, if the site is located on a hazardous waste, or on a site that's identified in the hazardous waste list called the Cortese list. Some people call it the Cortese list, but it's actually named after Dominic Cortese, who was the legislator who carried the legislation creating the list, so it's actually the Cortese list, we forget. And then most agencies will prepare some sort of technical studies when they're in doubt, so that they know whether or not they can actually apply this categorical exemption. I mentioned the city of Berkeley. City of Berkeley typically, of course, they're kind of an extreme, aren't they? But typically they require an applicant to come in with a traffic analysis, potentially with a noise analysis, all different sorts of analyses just to get a categorical exemption, because the city wants to make sure that there aren't any unusual circumstances that might otherwise trigger a more detailed CEQA analysis. So next. Okay, the Supreme Court won't get into this in much detail. It's kind of technical. But basically, the California Supreme Court recently had a decision relating to the categorical exemptions. And they said, well, you know, there's a two-phase test to determine whether or not you get to use one of these exemptions. And if there's something unusual about the site or its surroundings that would make this different than than other sites nearby, similarly situated, and if there's the potential for an environmental impact, well, you can't use an exemption. Okay, so that they've created this new two-part test. Okay, next. And then we talked about fair argument. Have to do an EIR when it can be fairly argued on the basis of substantial evidence in the record in front of the agency the project may have a significant effect on the environment. So the opponents of a project simply have to provide factual evidence that this project might have an impact on the environment. They don't have to prove it completely. They just have to provide this reasonable doubt, I guess is what you'd think about it. And then they have to provide that relatively specifically to the agency considering the project, to the agency that's preparing the CEQA document. So the fair argument could be raised at practically any hearing in front of the agency. It could be raised during the comment period on the draft environmental document. It could be raised practically up until the point the public agency bangs the gavel down at the end of their public hearing to decide the project. The fair argument, as I said, is intended to keep agencies on the straight and narrow so that they prepare environmental impact reports on projects that could potentially have an impact. It's a relatively low threshold or relatively low hurdle to jump over in order to trigger an environmental impact report. So next one. Substantial evidence, I think I already talked about this. Expert opinion, facts, that sort of thing. Simply arguing that you don't like the project or arguing that you think the project might have an impact, that's not substantial evidence. If you are unsubstantiated opinion, someone who doesn't know anything about the subject that they're talking about, that could be unsubstantiated opinion. And for agencies, the big challenge is recognizing one of these fair arguments when it's presented. And a lot of the CEQA lawsuits that you see coming out of the Court of Appeal are related to the opponents of the project arguing that the project should have had an environmental impact report and not a negative declaration. And so that's when it really comes out. Is there a fair argument that requires the agency to do an environmental impact report? And it's difficult sometimes for agencies to know whether there is or not. Is that person really an expert? They claim to know about birds, but how do I know that they're a bird expert? They don't have a PhD in avian ecology or anything like that. And yet, they might be 20-year members of the Audubon Society who can, I don't know, who can identify a yellow-crested warbler simply by the sound of its voice. So they could well be an expert, and it's very difficult sometimes for agencies on the fly at the public hearing to know whether or not their fair argument is being presented. Okay, so next one. So categorical exemptions, again, I guess we can jump over that. Basically, categorical exemptions can't be used if you have to add conditions to mitigate impacts. Categorical exemption can only be used on a clean project that doesn't have any potential for significant effects. So we can go on to the next one. Neg Decs and EIRs, both of these are what we call CEQA documents. They're actual, rather than being like a categorical exemption, which might simply be a finding by an agency, these actually require documentation. There's an initial study many times. There are maybe traffic studies that are done. If it's an environmental impact report, there's a particular format that the report has to follow. And so these are actual documents that are circulated for public review that have to be adopted and certified by the public agency as to their adequacy before it makes its decision. And so we think of these as CEQA documents, a negative declaration. So next one. This is what the initial study checklist looks like currently. This is simply taking one page out of the checklist. There's actually 17 or 18 different resource areas, from air quality to public utilities, greenhouse gases, all that sort of stuff. And each one has a little series of questions, and the agency or whoever is preparing the initial study checklist goes through that and determines how those things apply and whether or not there might be a significant effect. The initial study, oh, here we go, thank you. The initial study may depend on thresholds. Air quality, for example, has thresholds, so these numerical thresholds. In other cases, it may rely on the subjective determinations of the agency itself or their consultants. Things like aesthetics, for example. There's no threshold, there's no numerical thing for aesthetics. You just simply know it when you see it. Agencies have to avoid what's been called the naked checklist. In other words, you simply don't go through and check off the items on the list. You have to explain your reasoning for why you check them off, because CEQA requires not only data and conclusions, but also analysis that connects those two. Okay, next. And so we have these various check boxes there. No impact, meaning the project wouldn't have any impact. Less than significant impact, meaning no EIR is triggered. Less than significant impact with mitigation. No EIR is triggered, but we're going to apply a mitigation measure to the project. Potentially significant impact, we're triggering an EIR because this thing may have a significant impact. A fair argument exists there. And so if we check off that box on any one of the pages of our environmental checklist or our initial study checklist, that means we're going to be doing an environmental impact report. Okay, so next one. We're getting down in the weeds here. What else? Yeah, another way to think about fair argument disagreement among experts. That's, there's an admonishment here. Be careful. The record of defending a mitigated negative declaration in the face of fair argument is poor. There was a relatively new study done that indicates that somewhere around 60% of the challenges to negative declarations or mitigated negative declarations in court that have been published, the precedent-setting challenges over the last 15 years or so, 60% of them are successful. So out of 100 cases, the agency loses 60 of them. So it's, as I say, the record's relatively poor, and agencies have to be careful about deciding to do a mitigated negative declaration when there's a great deal of opposition, and the opposition seems to have some well-founded concerns. Okay, so mitigation, we talked about that term, mitigation this, mitigation that. What does it mean? It means some sort of action that the agency is either going to undertake itself or require the applicant, if it's a private project, to undertake, that avoids, minimizes, rectifies, reduces, or compensates for the impact. When an agency is adopting a mitigated negative declaration, the mitigation measures have to be detailed enough that it's quite clear that they're avoiding the impact. When they're approving a project, they have to apply those mitigation measures right in there as conditions of approval or as perhaps a design change, or they have to be reflected in the project itself. And then they have to adopt what's called a mitigation monitoring or reporting program, which is some method that the agency is promising to do that will allow them to determine whether or not this mitigation is actually being implemented. Okay, so next, what else do we have here? Yeah, we talked about feasibility, has to be reflecting conditions of approval, and then this mitigation monitoring reporting program has to be adopted whenever the agency adopts mitigation as part of its approval for a project. Deferred mitigation. So agencies can't promise to do something in the future except under limited circumstances. So for example, if I had a project, let's say my subdivision project, and I know that there's going to be impacts on the stream, and I know that it's a steelhead, well not steelhead, let's say salmon. Salmon run up and down this stream here in the city of Sacramento during salmon season. It would not be sufficient mitigation for me to say, we're going to study the salmon in the future, and we're going to decide what we're going to do about it once we finish our study. That's not a mitigation measure. Essentially, that's deferring the mitigation to some future time because we haven't studied it. We don't know exactly what we're going to do. Mitigation requires that you have done enough of a study that you can specify the sorts of things you're going to do, or specify a set of performance standards so that once you come up with your mitigation, it's clear in the mitigation measure the things that you have to tick off to get to full mitigation or mitigation of that project. Yeah, there we go, that project. And I have to adopt that. If I'm in the city, I need to adopt that mitigation measure as part of my project approval. So I have to commit to it. So if I commit to it and there are specific performance standards and it's clear in the environmental document that I've actually done a study of this and I'm not just blowing smoke over these standards, then deferred mitigation is okay. And so typically that means deferred mitigation in a mitigated negative declaration will probably not stand legal scrutiny, but in an environmental impact report you have a better chance of it actually working. Okay, so next. So these are the typical things that are in a mitigated negative declaration. Obviously, you need to describe the project and where it's located and who's proposing it, the proposed finding that it's not going to have a significant effect, a copy of the initial study and any other sorts of studies that the agency has done, mitigation measures listed out, and this sort of initial study, negative declaration, mitigated negative declaration, that's the package of material that will be circulated to the public, made available to the public, and circulated to other agencies for them to review and comment on before the lead agency gets to take action on the project. Okay, so next. So public review of it, 30-day review for most projects. Public notice goes out, all of that sort of thing. So I think, are we on to EIRs? Here we go, environmental impact reports. Same idea. Better, it's got a bigger, typically a bigger set of subjects that you look at. Typically it's a larger document, although not always, but typically a larger document. There'll be an executive summary, there'll be a description of the project and usually excruciating detail. There'll be environmental analysis that's done by resource area, so air quality analysis, biological resources analysis, cultural resources analysis, et cetera, et cetera. In that analysis, they'll talk about the setting, or what's out there right now, the regulations that apply to the project, whether or not the project's going to have a significant effect on the environment, and if it does have a significant effect, what mitigation measures are going to be imposed on this project. And then it's also required to look at a reasonable range of alternatives to the project. The idea being, mitigation is one way of avoiding impacts. Another way would be to simply choose a different project. So the alternatives would be things that meet the same objectives as the project we're considering, but do it in a different way, or perhaps on a different site, perhaps with a different configuration that avoid one or more of its potential significant impacts. And then we also have to look at growth-inducing and cumulative impacts as those might apply to the project too. So next one. What else do we have here? So typical things that are done for an EIR, it has a notice of preparation that goes out, letting the public and other agencies know we're going to be preparing an EIR. Let us know your initial thoughts about it. A draft EIR, which goes out for its own public review, typically 45 days, for review and comment by the public and by other agencies. And then a final EIR, which includes the draft EIR plus written responses to all of the related comments that came in on the draft EIR. So you have the draft, the comments, written responses to those comments, a list of who commented, and that taken all together is a final EIR. That's what the agency will look at and consider in making their decision on the project. And if there's some sort of legal challenge, that's what will be challenged, the final EIR. And so once an agency approves its project, it also has to make specific findings about, well, what happened with all the impacts we identified? Did we avoid them? Are they still significant? That sort of thing. If they have significant unavoidable impacts, they have to undertake what's called a statement of overriding considerations, a statement that explains what the benefits of this project are versus its significant unavoidable impacts and why those benefits outweigh the project's impacts. And then mitigation monitoring program too. Okay, and I think that's it. Yeah, so some common types. We'll just zip through these. Project EIR, typically for an individual project. Program EIR, usually for a bigger project. You may see something called a subsequent EIR or a subsequent mitigated negative declaration. As its name implied, an environmental impact report's already been done for this project. We're now looking at the later activity under the project, and what do you know, the later activity has a new impact. What we're going to do is subsequent environmental impact report to focus in on just that new impact. Next one. There we go. So we talked about fair argument. Fair argument doesn't apply to an environmental impact report. So there may be disagreements among experts, and as long as it's represented in the environmental impact report and the discussions that go on during the preparation of the report, that's adequate as far as CEQA is concerned. Okay, so next one. So mitigation, we talked about that. We'll go on to the next one. So common types of EIRs, there's some more information about that. Program EIRs for large projects, tiered EIR, an EIR being done later for where a previous EIR had already been done, and then a subsequent EIR. Under tiered EIR, the legislature has gone wild over the last 6 or 7 years, and they've adopted perhaps, what, four or five different ways of tiering later environmental analyses off of existing EIRs. A lot of them relate to sustainable community strategies. There was the bill SB 375 carried a number of years ago, required regional agencies as part of their regional transportation plans to also prepare a sustainable community strategy. And that was intended in some ways to streamline the CEQA process. Once you've done one of these sustainable community strategies, the legislation will provide a couple of different ways of tiering later analyses off of those studies. Since then, the legislature has adopted either 2 or 3 additional ways of doing that, of tiering from those. So now we have maybe 6 or 7 different ways of tiering, each of them different, each of them having their own unique characteristics, each of them being applied in different sorts of situations. So when you hear the word tiering, it doesn't mean one single way of doing CEQA. It may be one of a variety of different ways of doing CEQA, all of which allow you to take an original EIR and relate a later project that's consistent with that EIR to that EIR, and thereby reduce the analysis that's required for that new project. You get to build on the original EIR. You get to tier upon it. Okay, so next one. What else have we got here? Okay, so subsequent EIRs, we can pretty much jump over that, I think. So planning commissioners, I don't know why I have that in here. Maybe this is an old version. Anyway, the planning commission, typically you have a city council, on many projects, you have a city council and a planning commission considering the project. If the project is legislative in nature, in other words, if they're adopting a new general plan, if they're adopting a new zoning ordinance, if they're amending a general plan or zoning ordinance, those go through the planning commission and then on to the city council for approval. So at least two sets of hearings. Something that is delegated to the planning commission alone, subdivision maps, variances, conditional use permits are typical things that a planning commissioner reviews. Those simply go to the planning commission, and then if they're appealed, they would go to the city council, but otherwise the commission has final word. So when they're acting, as their own, when they have the final word, the commission would adopt the exemption, they would adopt the mitigated negative declarant. They're essentially the lead agency under CEQA. If it's something that needs to go to the city council, then the city council would be the lead agency under CEQA. If it's something that is appealed to the city council, you kind of have the planning commission as the original lead agency, and then on appeal, the city council now acting as lead agency. So you could have the two agencies within the same city reaching different conclusions. Because it may be that perhaps the project was denied by the planning commission. Applicant appeals it to the city council, and the city council approves the project. So the CEQA part of it doesn't necessarily direct the planning commission or the city council to either approve or deny the project. That's independent of it, but it will inform the entire process. So it informs the planning commission if it's the last word, informs the city council if it's the last word, informs both of them if something goes from the from the planning commission to the city council, either normally or by appeal. Okay, so I guess that's about it. Okay, so we have planning commissioners. We can hop over this because we're not really planning commissioners here. Okay, here we have some people. So here's this case, Berkeley Hillside Preservation. This is a case where there was a fair argument that was claimed, and this kind of shows the difficulty of determining whether or not there's a fair argument when you are the public agency and someone presents you with this information. The opponents hired a geotechnical engineer. Geotechnical engineer looked at the set of plans for this proposed single-family house in the Berkeley Hills, declared that this is going to have all kinds of impact. It could potentially set off landslides. There's going to be mass grading. You have trucks going up and down the streets to carry away waste materials from the grading, so on and so forth. Supreme Court looked at it. What do you know? The geotechnical engineer was actually looking at the wrong set of plans. And so that wasn't a fair argument, because it's not a fair argument if you're looking at the wrong set of plans. That's not substantiated opinion relating to the project. So we can hit the next one, I think. Yeah, and then we talked about the unusual circumstances. This is the case to establish that two-step test, kind of getting down in the weeds about that sort of stuff. So we can jump over that. Here we have Creed 21. This is one that held up an emergency exemption just recently, just as an example of the sorts of cases that run through the courts. The city replaced a storm drain damage under an exemption. The Creed 21 folks sued, claiming that they needed to do an environmental impact report because of potential damage that would have occurred as a result of the storm drain. And the court said, no, you don't have to do it, that sort of thing. The exemption applied to this as an emergency project, and once that emergency project is done, then that's done. It was never subject to CEQA. And so you can't apply a fair argument to it because it simply wasn't subject to CEQA. It was statutorily exempt. Okay, so let's see what else. Yeah, they're all planning commission. Yeah, so we can hop over those. I don't know if we have anything else of importance.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so there's basic information. The series website here, CERES.gov/CEQA, is available from the Natural Resources Agency. Office of Planning and Research has a bunch of technical advisories on CEQA. They are also the folks who draft changes to the CEQA guidelines. So you can go on their website and find out what's happening with changes to the CEQA guidelines. And the Planning and Conservation League has this nice book, Community Guide to CEQA. It's kind of taken from the point of view of community activists, the sort of people who sue agencies over CEQA. So if you're an agency, maybe you need to read it through a mirror or something, so it's in reverse. But it's primarily aimed at community activists, but it's still a really good primer on CEQA. And so that's it for me.
Well, thank you. Are there any quick questions or long questions for Terry before we move on to the next presentation? So use the raise hand function or type them in now, and thank you for that great presentation. Had a lot of good information in it.
Maybe I've put people to sleep. So if that's the case, hopefully there won't be any questions.
Any questions in the room?
I'm a little confused on the question before I ask it, so I'll hopefully ask it in a clear way. I know that there was a lot of talk, especially when the Sacramento was having the thing with the arena, that the city council, based on the way CEQA is carried out, are using maybe an unfair advantage to expedite it because they want it. How political can it sometimes be when choosing these exemptions? Is it always based on the environmental impacts, and that's the main argument, or does it sometimes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it varies. You know, it varies on what the project is, whether or not the city council is really in love with the project, and sometimes you do see cities try to cut corners in order to avoid having to go through the long CEQA process. Sacramento really didn't do that. They did a complete environmental impact report on the arena and all that sort of stuff. But they did go to the legislature and get special legislation that helped insulate them from the lawsuits that occurred after they had approved the arena. So there were 2 or 3 lawsuits that they were successful in defending, in part because of the special legislation that they got. So, you know, if you have an in with a legislator and the governor's willing to sign it, you might be able to get some sort of legislation that would help you out as well. But politics can enter into the CEQA process, and that's one reason why, I think, why we have this whole fair argument idea, and why we have, you know, almost anybody being able to sue an agency over the adequacy of their environmental document. That's intended to keep agencies honest.
Any other final questions? I guess maybe while we're preparing for the next one, can you just provide a bit of background for those that are interested in CEQA moving forward? How do you work in the CEQA field, or what are the steps you have to take?
Yeah, well, what are the steps you have to take? You have to get hired by somebody. That's one thing. And there's really there's 2 or 3 different places that you could work. You could work for a public agency and, you know, do CEQA through the public agency. You could work for a consultant in kind of a general role where you're managing or writing portions of CEQA documents. Or you could be a consultant, for example, that specializes in a particular thing. Greenhouse gas and emissions analysis, air quality analysis, noise analysis, biological resources. So it's a variety of different ways you can get involved in the CEQA process. Yeah, and so it just depends. Just depends on how you want to do that.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, if others have questions, you can type them in and we can get to them at the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly.
Well, first a comment and then a question for Terry. So the comment is thank you. That was amazing. I would say if folks understood everything you just said and remember it, they're about entry-level CEQA practitioners.
Yeah,
would that be correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah. So you guys don't underestimate the value of this training, and you know, save it. It'll be up on the LGC website, right? So thank you for sharing that with us. Terry teaches classes, so you guys just got schooled, literally, in CEQA by a CEQA teacher. Yeah, so what, if somebody wanted, you know, we have these 38 members, they're graduating. If they wanted to get an entry-level position, is that possible out of college with a year of experience working with local government on environmental issues? Or is there an intermediary step, you think, before people need to dive into the CEQA world? Yeah,
it's certainly something you can do right after college. I mean, we have a number of people, and just within my firm, we hire a few people every year who are entry-level people.
What does an entry-level person do? And
it depends on what their speciality is. We have some people who, you know, work for us in air quality analysis, or someone who, you know, may know something about traffic analysis. So it kind of depends on what sort of thing you come out of college with. We also have generalists who work for us. It seems to me as though for an entry-level position, it's easier to get on board with some sort of speciality that you may have, you know, an ability to do, to crunch numbers through air quality analysis and that sort of thing. I know that we train people in those sorts of things. So noise analysis, air quality analysis, the people who have working on that didn't come to us necessarily knowing all about it, but they had some sort of a, you know, collegiate background in it and had a general idea of how you do it. And as far as running the models and all the technical stuff, we trained them in that. For general people, Typically, you wouldn't be hired as a generalist. Typically, those people have at least a couple of years of experience under their belt somewhere, whether it's with a public agency or whether it would be with another consultant. They typically have some experience. That's because they have to have a better idea of what the whole CEQA process is. Whereas if you're doing just technical work, air quality or whatever it might be, you know that part, but you don't necessarily have to know the rest. Whereas somebody who's a generalist has to have a pretty good idea of how the process works and what notices go out when and all of that sort of thing.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So hi everybody, I'm Holly Roberson, Land Use Counsel at OPR and big fan of CivicSpark. So today I'm going to talk with you briefly about 2-3 things. Jenny, how much time do I have? 20 minutes. Okay, that's awesome. So the first thing I wanted to let you all know is I want to elaborate on where you can find CEQA. Terry briefly mentioned that OPR updates the CEQA guidelines. So sometimes when you're looking up CEQA, and for those of you in the room, I brought a book for show and tell.
Okay.
So that's CEQA, and it's in 2 sections. So the first is the Public Resources Code, and that's what the legislature says, this is now a change in the law. The second part is it's under the California Code of Regulations, and those of you who have a legal bent or are thinking about going to law school will appreciate knowing that regulations are essentially more or less almost laws made by agencies. The courts have deferred quite significantly to the California Code of Regulations that OPR does, which is the CEQA guidelines. It goes through what's called the Administrative Procedure Act, APA rulemaking process at an agency. In this case, it's the Natural Resources Agency, has public comment and goes through a lot of somewhat similar processes to what happens in the legislature. So that's one of the things we have the extreme privilege of doing at OPR is helping to draft those regulations. I want to give you 2 examples of things we're doing right now. They may come up in your work or in your future job search if you're interested in CEQA stuff. These are kind of up-and-coming trends. So the first is actually my colleague and our senior counsel, Christopher Calfee, has worked really hard on this for quite a while, and it's a comprehensive update to the CEQA guidelines. So overall, and I've asked Jenny to put it up on the screen here, and if you scroll down, I'd like to show folks the table of contents to this, Jenny. And you guys will see it's called a preliminary discussion draft. Mm-hmm. And that is because it is a preliminary discussion draft. These, as you might have picked up from Terry's presentation, there are a lot of folks who are interested in CEQA, the business community, the environmental community, all sorts of local governments, state agencies. A lot of people have a stake in how this plays out. And so there's both substantive and procedural changes just over time. Some things have, the courts interact with the statute and the regulations, and so things need to be updated to reflect the current state of the law as it's changed. Then if you scroll down a little bit more, so a lot of these are procedural, they're about efficiency, making the statute itself in the process work better. Then if you go down under substance improvements, we've got a couple particularly around energy and water supply assessments, and those are changes in a way to how we're thinking about the environment and what needs to happen. What you're not seeing here specifically, and one thing that I'm being asked to talk to you today, and I'm going to kind of punt on it, is climate change in CEQA and how that works. That factors in a really interesting way. For example, if you're setting the baseline, right? And who can tell me out there in phone land or here in the room, what did Terry say about what a baseline is under CEQA?
Right now, what's happening in conditions.
Right. But what if in the context of climate change, you know that that's going to change. Then what do you use for a baseline? I'm seeing puzzled looks. So CEQA practitioners all have this same puzzled look on their face right now. So that's an example of an issue that's very much a live issue. We, in the Governor Brown administration, and about 99.9% of the city environmental community understand that climate change is real, it's happening, and assumptions we've had for a long time about pretty simple things like what the water level is near San Francisco Airport. Those could change. So say if you're hypothetically trying to develop something along the waterfront in San Francisco, your safety analysis, your water analysis, your sense of water supply, given that we have this drought and groundwater depletion, all of those things may be a little more flexible in the future, given the context of climate change. For those of you who are working directly with local governments around the office, I don't know, we imagine people talking around the water cooler, hey, did you see those great CEQA guidelines, proposed discussion draft? They might not be doing that, but it's worth you knowing as young professionals that this is currently in a public comment phase. So what that means is until mid-October, people can write letters about it. We'll probably get a letter from Terry's firm. Yeah, great. Look forward to that. It'll,
They look really good, I think, in general.
Great, great. Yeah, we had Chris does a nice job with the formatting. Yeah. But a lot of technical work went into this. Other big changes that are coming up, we have what's called SB 743. We all have a bad habit of referring to things by their bill number, and then every year the bill numbers get recycled. So you have to know that that's SB 743 from a couple, in the past, not in the future. And that one is actually changing the way that we do transportation impact analysis, which is fundamentally related to climate change and some of the work that some of you all have been doing. So, for example, those of you who've worked on a greenhouse gas emission analysis, or if you're looking at transportation impacts or helping improve bike lanes, when we look at California's climate profile or footprint, if you will, a big chunk of it is transportation. I'm saying not, right? So when you look at, for example, a new project, you would do a traffic study impact, right? And in the past, that's been based on level of service, which is actually, it's more of a convenience measure. It's how much you're sitting in traffic, how much of a delay there is. Somewhat tied to greenhouse gases in that if a car is sitting there idling at a stoplight, you've got those emissions coming out. But when you look at the bigger picture, and we've done quite a lot of technical analysis with this by my colleague Chris Ganson, you can start to look at vehicle miles traveled. And so it's not just how much traffic is backing up, it's more, is this creating more car trips? And that implicitly favors infill and disfavors sprawl development because they're generating more trips and they're new trips. And it would also favor something that has a built-in connection with public transit or bike lanes. That is a very rudimentary explanation of that. I am not the expert on that. So we're making changes to CEQA to the extent we have the legislative authority to do so. And that's why SB 743 is important, because it's a law that the legislature said, OPR, figure this out, right? So our elected body has said, this is an issue we want to address. Is there anything you would add to that part, Terry? About
the only thing I'll add a couple of things. One is that it's a legislative mandate signed by the governor and all that sort of stuff. So it's something that agencies are going to have to do. They're going to have to switch from level of service standard as their traffic matrix or traffic analysis to vehicle miles traveled. But that has not necessarily gotten through to the average person on the street, so to speak. And so there's going to be blowback once this takes effect, the city council is going to be faced by people who are concerned about traffic in their neighborhood, and they're going to have to tell them that, you know, the traffic in your neighborhood is no longer a CEQA issue. Yeah, the roads are going to be congested, but CEQA doesn't care about that anymore. And here in the CEQA guidelines, what we're mostly worried about is vehicle miles traveled. So instead of looking at the local impact on congestion, we're going to be looking at the regional impact of how many miles people travel. And so that's going to be big. Local people are going to just go crazy when they hear that, because when you look at, when I work on EIRs for projects all the time, one of the top things that comes up is traffic. What do people hate most? Traffic. But the second thing, probably water supply and growth. But traffic is almost always number one. And so OPR and the Resources Agency are kind of being put in a bad position. That's the second thing, is you're kind of being put in a bad position in that you guys are having to come up with these rules, and I think you're doing a great job so far. They seem to be very, the previous drafts seem good, and it's going to be soon a third draft of it, which should be even better. Those rules are being crafted by these agencies because they have to, and they're going to come in for a lot of criticism and that sort of thing by the local agencies, by other public agencies that realize that once these things are in place, we now have to explain to our constituents why traffic congestion is no longer a big issue and why we're going to be looking at vehicle miles traveled. So there's going to be a lot of blowback for local agencies because of this statewide law that we're working on. And some of that, I think, is washing up onto OPR and the CRISs as they go about putting these guidelines together, because it's not their fault. They have to do this, and they're doing a great job of coming up with the guidelines and how to address VMT and all that. But they're catching some of this blowback, and there's going to be even more at the local level once these take effect.
So that's an interesting example of the way in which the law changes over time and how CEQA is a fairly dynamic statute. Some people love that it's dynamic. Some people hate that it's dynamic. And those of you who continue in an environmental career, you'll come across fellow CEQA geeks and nerds. I'm slowly realizing I actually like CEQA. And then other people are just allergic to it, right? So it's good to get some exposure early, I would say, and figure out if you think this is fascinating, the way that public policy gets implemented into law and that then gets implemented at the local level and can actually influence where a gas station goes or where new housing development goes and people's quality of life and how the state develops. Or whether it's just so procedural that it makes your eyes cross and you don't want to have anything to do with it, and you'd rather work, directly on, well, we talked about Audubon and the great work they do with habitat preservation and birds and having a much more concrete, immediate impact on things. So I think it just depends really as young professionals on your bent toward level of detail and abstraction. But it is one of the most powerful tools in the toolbox of anybody working on the environment in California. So whether you're inclined to love it or hate it, it's worth knowing about just as a valuable tool to have in your kit. With a few minutes left, let me give you guys a concrete example of something I'm working on very passionately right now, which is tribal cultural resources. And I've got my PowerPoint here. It's the same one I give to consultants and the Association of Environmental Professionals and state folks and everybody. You're not going to get the whole PowerPoint because it'll be sent to you and be up on the website. But just it took me a long time to find a politically neutral picture.
It is.
So I figured California poppies were like a safe bet. So something exciting is that, Terry talks a lot about different kinds of environmental impacts. And those are all impacts to environmental resources. And there are just really a handful, I would say, of environmental resources in CEQA. And this adds a new one, which is uncommon. It's pretty rare. So this one is tribal cultural resources. And so it's actually defining an impact to a tribal cultural resource which is defined in the law, as an impact to the environment. The reason this law came about is through California's history of development, tribes have cultural and sacred sites all over the state. Tribes inhabited the whole state. And then, as all of you will know from your history classes, tribes nowadays mostly are living in reservations, and so they've lost access to a lot of the land that was important to them. So for this reason, just like an endangered species could live anywhere, it could live on private property, it could live on public property. A tribal cultural resource, something that's very important to tribes as a culturally or for sacred religious purposes or ceremony, that could be on a reservation or it could not be. It could be on private property or government-owned property. Just as with endangered species, where there aren't very many left, and so the idea is to protect what's left. Similarly, with tribal cultural resources, as the state has developed, as it's continuing to develop, and we're looking at 50 million people in the near future, the idea is to protect what's left. So this is part of an ongoing process under planning through SB 18. So local governments have already had a consultation process in place with California Native American tribes, which is both federally and non-federally recognized tribes. And if you're interested about that distinction, I can talk with you more about that offline, since it takes a bit of time to explain. When they're updating their general plan or designating open space or doing a specific plan. And then Governor Brown himself has been quite active in this space. So he issued an executive order saying that state agencies encouraging state agencies to consult and communicate with California tribes. And we now have the position of the governor's tribal advisor. So that's Cynthia Gomez, and she reports directly to the governor on issues of tribal importance. Next slide, please. So if folks were doing CEQA correctly and carefully, and Terry talked about how sometimes things are done with more level of detail or less level of detail. If you get into the nuances of historic resources in CEQA, there was a way to look at tribal cultural resources, but now this spells it out explicitly. It's its own category in our updated draft Appendix G. Appendix G. See, we're talking jargon already. Appendix G is the initial study checklist. It's an optional checklist, but most folks pretty much use it as far as we can tell. But they can have their own. So it just makes it harder to miss. It also elevates tribes to, well, tribes have always been sovereign governments, but within this process, it acknowledges that and gives tribes a seat at the table as sovereign governments early enough in the process to potentially influence how the project is planned, right? So Terry talked a lot about mitigation of environmental impacts. But before that, you have the option to design something to avoid an impact to a specific site if you know it's there. That's not just for tribal cultural resources, it's for other resources as well. So part of what this does is it's hard to avoid something if you don't know it's there. And tribal cultural resources can sometimes not be obvious to the untrained eye, or sometimes because for some reason sacred sites tend to be unfortunately defaced by people once they know that they're there. In order to protect them, the tribes often prefer to keep that information confidential. So the statute creates a confidential consultation process. And there's a notice and consultation process. If you continue to the next slide, please. It's complex, and I'm not going to detail it because you'll have the PowerPoint. And if you're interested in the issue, feel free to follow up with me. But essentially, it gives tribes a chance to communicate beforehand what their stuff is and where when a project is proposed, so that hopefully it can be avoided, if not avoided, preserved, if not preserved, mitigated. mitigation measures and how that comes out will be interesting to see as the law is implemented. This is the definition. Next slide, please. Notice and timing, too technical. Next slide, please. So this is what OPR has to do. So we've been asked to update Appendix G with relevant sample questions, also separate out paleontology, which is dinosaurs and plants from the dinosaur era, from tribes. So that is just patently should not be mixed in with this, and so that's been taken care of. And then have additional questions that are relevant to tribal cultural resources. Next slide, please. So then once we do that, it goes over to the Natural Resources Agency, and they take it through the public rulemaking process. And then it becomes a regulation, or in this case, an addition to the checklist. That's in CEQA. And then it fits in with all the stuff Terry talked about going through the checklist and looking for mitigation. A lot of our process is informal outreach and listening. So I have the privilege of traveling around the state and getting to meet with tribal folks and getting to meet with local governments and hear their questions and concerns about this. We're collaborating with the Native American Heritage Commission, which is a California commission that works on preservation of tribal cultural heritage, among other things. And if you want to stay involved in this issue, if you sign up on our listserv, even after you're done with CivicSpark, you can get updates on the CEQA guidelines. I mean, how exciting is that? So that's about it for tribal cultural resources. I would be happy to answer any questions you guys have about what we do at OPR or this issue in particular.
Thank you, Holly. So any final questions? I know we're about out of time, but if there are any quick questions, type them in now. If not, I know this has been a lot of information to process. And what we will do is we'll put all the recording and all the PowerPoints on the website and share them with you guys. So if you have any follow-up questions after you process all this information, you can always email them to me and I'll get them answered by Terry or Holly.
Yeah. I feel like this is like college where the professors do a review at the end of the semester, and just as you guys are finishing your projects or cramming for finals, it's like, here's this final lecture with all this content.
Yeah.
So we really, with Terry's presentation, saved the best for last for you guys, and I do encourage you to revisit it when your brains are fresh, because that is one of the best summaries of CEQA and introductions to it I've seen.
That's great. Well, thank you guys again, and have a good day, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We'll see you at graduation.
I have a question for you, Holly, actually. I was wondering, like, when you first started doing the tribal resource